welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am here with one of our, can I call you a friend of the show because you're on a lot?
Yes. Yes,
Christina
absolutely.
Henry is a friend of the show. And before we started recording, I was explaining how I became hooked on her books. I think The Ghost Tree was the first one I read, and then I'm like, well, I need to read everything she's written. And I love her books, and you should be reading them.
Thank you so much. And it's just, and I was saying to you, it's really cool for me because, like a lot of writers, I read a lot and I was a library kid. And I was one of those kids who went to the library and checked out like 15 books, whatever the maximum amount of books allowed was at the time. And then, would go home with them and come back like 3 days later having read all the books, looking for more books. So it's just exciting to me to even have my books in libraries, as an adult.
Well, they're great. And I'm happy to put them in readers' hands, but let's talk about this book, The Place Where They Buried Your Heart. There's so many things that can be said about it. So actually, first in your words, how would you describe the book? Like, what is it about?
So I've kind of been saying I think if you're a fan of, it's maybe kind of it crossed with Monster House. Um, so I think if you kind of go for those vibes, this book would be for you. It's about a girl named Jessie. She's 13 at the start of the book. She's at home. She's been grounded because she was caught smoking. And her little brother comes in her room, wants to play a board game. She's grumpy. She wants him to scram. So she dares him to go into the house down the street, this abandoned house that's on their block. And he goes with his two friends, Richie and Jake, and only Richie and Jake come back because the house eats her brother, and not in a metaphorical sense.
I am really glad you mentioned Monster House because that's one of those movies that I feel like a lot of people forget about and they
Hmm.
shouldn't because it was really good. I really enjoyed it. It's definitely one of again those movies that I felt like was kind of overlooked. And this was a really interesting take on it. You know, it's so funny because a lot of times horror kind of goes in cycles. And I read this almost directly after I read Rachel Harrison's Plain Nice, which is also a haunted house book, but
Hmm.
neither of them are so much. I mean, I guess that's a possessed house book, but still,
Hmm.
it is kind of play on that. But neither of them are really a traditional take on that idea. And I like it because what it also deals with is haunted people. And one of the things that was so good about the place where they buried your heart was how much I felt for Jess. She's only, I think, a few years older than me. And she has the same name as me, and I could just really picture her entire like life. It felt very much like, you know, growing up where your parent and like now I feel really old because I don't do this to my kids, but like your parent, if they were mad at you, they'd use your full name and you
Hmm.
knew it. And her mom, when her mom's angry, she speaks in all caps, and that
Hmm.
was like one of my favorite little things reading it. But also, there's this weird sense of there's different kinds of grief, and there's like the ambiguous grief, and then there's the constant, like the very traditional grief. And she goes through it all. I don't want to give away too much about it, but
Right.
it really is about coping and about guilt and the house in the center of it, it reminds me of a lot of media, which has sort of taken a real life tragedy and decided to bring it into pop culture. So I'm curious, when did you start writing this? And was the story influenced by anything specific?
So wrote it, I have to think now about the years, which is always dangerous. I started writing it in the fall of 2023, and I finished it last year in 2024. And like a lot of my books, it started with an image that I saw in my head. So I saw three boys go into a house and only two come out again. And that the way that I write is that I usually have either an image in my head or I have a line that comes to me, sometimes a line of dialogue, sometimes a line of prose, and I write so I can find out what this is, whatever this thing in my head that I've seen is. So I said to myself, who are those kids? And so I started writing so I could find out.
Yeah, I really felt for them, and I think there is sort of this generational love, be it Goonies, be it Stranger Things, of the idea of kids going in up against something supernatural that's impossible. But because that there's a loss so quickly during one of Jess's formative years, it's really heartbreaking. And what I again, like, one of the things that was really remarkable about it was how much emotion you packed into each part. I wanted to talk a little bit also just about the perspective, because I had like this feeling while I was reading it that I was sort of like, she's narrating her life to me, which was a really interesting way of reading. Like, it almost reminded me of when Goodfellas, I believe, when is it, it's Scorsese?
Yeah.
Yeah, I should know that. I feel really stupid just saying that. But,
Yeah.
saying that he wanted it to feel like the entire movie was like a trailer almost. And, the way that it's narrated, it does. And I kind of got a very similar sense reading this, because you are going through everything with Jess. But again, it's like very much like she's sitting down across from you with a cup of coffee and she's explaining how she got from this point where her brother Paul, or Paulie, which she was teasing him with a baby name, he died, to where she is now. Um, it's different, I believe, than some of the other books that you've read. How did her voice kind of come to you?
Yeah, it was pretty instantaneous because the first line of the book is that she was 13 and her brother Paul was 8 and she was home grounded and that um her brother died and she wasn't there, but it was still her fault. And so that voice came to me right away, this idea that something bad had happened in her family and that she felt responsible. And so it was so easy to go from there because, there's this kind of thing that happens to her where she's just being a kid. I mean, everybody who has siblings has told their siblings to get out of their room. And I have three younger siblings, and sometimes you just don't want to deal with them. And the tragedy of her life is that she does this perfectly ordinary thing and it has this horrific ramifications, not just for her personally, but for her parents, who never get over the loss of their son. And that this sort of cascading um, grief, like, is something that she sort of takes on herself. Um, but also that she's still her parents' child, and she doesn't understand why they love her dead brother more than they love her living self.
And that's really, really hard. And, I think she does always kind of define herself by herself versus Paul. And Paul never had a chance to grow up to be a troublemaker or
Mhm.
anything. So, it's almost like she's given a role and she tries to break out of it, but she, just falls into this web. I really also liked it was a very organic feel for just the town, the area where she lived, the street, the block that she lived on, and how everybody related to one another. Um, did their voices kind of come in clear as well?
Yeah, so this, in a lot of ways, this is a love letter to the neighborhood that I live in Chicago, which is known as Wrigleyville. It's sort of a sub-neighborhood of an official neighborhood, which is Lakeview. But basically, it's sort of the area around Wrigley Field, which is where I live. And I think that there's a perception from people who don't live in Chicago or even in other cities that people who live in cities, it's sort of a transitory population that like people maybe move in when they're young and then they move out to the suburbs when they're older, things like that. But that's not really my experience, and that's not the experience I think of a lot of people who live here. People move to neighborhoods and they put down roots. And that was what I really wanted to convey in the story is that, there are people who live there and who stay there and they're part of the fabric of that neighborhood. And there's this idea which I think is very strange that you can't raise kids in a city, and I've raised my own son in a city, my neighbors raise their kids here. Um, and like the life of children um is very important to the story. The kids who kind of grow up around the house and the rumors about the house and the kind of effect that it has on them. Um, because the house, um, sort of when it's unable to take more victims from the neighborhood, it sort of reaches out for kids from other parts of the city.
Had you been, because I know it's a little slightly name dropped, just inspired at all by Amityville?
Not like in a super direct way. I'm a Gen Xer, which means I grew up with Amityville. Of course, watched the movie when I was young, read the book when I was young. He claims, of course, that that is real. It is obviously not.
Yeah, it's not, it's actually not far from here.
Yeah.
Amityville is, I think, about a 10-15 minute drive from here. And what's striking to me about it is, we have like many areas have like this jack-o'-lantern display event that happens. And there was one, last year was the last year of that particular one, but it's in an area which old houses are restored. And there's a house that's the same style as the original Amityville house. And they have a pumpkin display around it, and the display 100% only talks about the movie and what
Hmm.
Lutz said happened, and does not even slightly acknowledge the fact that the DeFeos died in the house for real. And
Yeah.
that is like an actual tragedy that happened there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the thing about Amityville that's I think interesting is yeah that there was this sort of true crime event that occurs in the house, and later though becomes famous for these supposedly supernatural happenings. And I think if people have never read the book, it's wonderful to read as a work of fiction. But take it with a grain of salt because his claims that this is a true story of something that happened to the family are pretty ludicrous. But I think that when I was writing my book, yeah, there is what people might think of as an inciting event in the house, as the main character kind of goes back in time trying to figure out what has happened. But it turns out that that tragedy isn't even the beginning of the thing. So, there's the thing about the house is that it doesn't belong in this neighborhood. It doesn't architecturally look like the rest of the neighborhood. Um, a lot of the streets around here where I live are what's called a Chicago two flat. It's got like a gray stone face or um, a brick face. They're meant to be multifamily homes. They have what's called the Chicago entry, which is a an entry that's raised above the street level. And the reason why they were raised above the street level is because the city used to sink. It literally was sinking in the 19th century because the city was built on swampland. So they would sort of raise the entry to hedge against the sinking. And then it just became an architectural feature of a lot of houses. And this building doesn't have that. And um, it becomes a conundrum for Jessie because she's trying to find out, she's trying to figure out, can you kind of stop the house? And in order to stop the house, she's trying to trace the origin of the house. And the house just seems to have always been there, which is sort of mysterious unto itself.
I love it. And one of the things I love the most about this type of thing is just this idea that, yeah, something is impossible and eternal at the same time, which I guess, one could say that about it or just in general, um, eh, that history is always repeating itself. And, there are these things that people just kind of are like, oh yeah, no, that's there. That's been there forever. Is it weird? And I love that. And that's creepy in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, and there becomes this kind of strange acceptance in the neighborhood that the house is there and that it's just always going to be there, and there's just really nothing you can do about it. And there's also what one character describes as sort of inside people and outside people. And those are sort of like the inside people are the people who are aware of the house and what it does. And the outside people are people who just think it's like some crumbling bit of junk and they don't understand why it hasn't been torn down. So there's also like kind of different levels of awareness in the neighborhood as well as outside of it, because there's people who come to visit who've never been there who seem to realize what the house is.
Well, again, it's extremely emotional. It's scary. It's just oh so good. And I once again have to add this to my pile of Christina Henry books that have slightly made me cry, but
Aw.
also scared me.
Hmm. And I think that's kind of what you want from horror. I think that you want the sort of elevated sense of emotion, whether it's the scares, whether it's the sadness, whether it's whatever, or even that laugh of relief when nothing happens.
Absolutely. Man, thank you so much, Christina. I mean, I know you're always writing. Do you have anything upcoming that you're allowed to talk about?
Yeah, so I have another book coming out next year, called Pin Feather. Well, it's right now it's called Pin Feathers. Who knows if it will still be called Pin Feathers when it comes out, but it is about a woman who has a baby who may be turning into a bird.
Well, I'm going to read it and hopefully we'll talk about it.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Check out The Place Where They Buried Your Heart. It is so good. It is so, so good. And any of Christina Henry's books, really, because I cannot get enough of her stuff.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.